Right now, as you're watching this video, cells from a woman who died over 70 years ago might be working inside your body. They helped create the vaccine that protected you from polio. They're in the COVID vaccine that saved millions of lives. They've been to space, survived nuclear bombs, and generated billions of dollars in profits. But here's the shocking part. The woman these cells came from died in poverty. Her family couldn't afford health insurance. And for 24 years, they had no idea her cells were even being used. Hi everyone, Alex Reed here. Welcome to Real Dark Cases, where we uncover the true stories behind history's most haunting mysteries. Today's story involves something that sounds like science fiction, but is absolutely real. Immortal human cells that have been alive and growing in laboratories for over 7 decades. These cells have touched your life in ways you never imagined. Picture Baltimore, 1951. The world was recovering from war, but America was still deeply segregated. Most hospitals refused to treat black patients entirely. Johns Hopkins was different. It was one of the few places in the country where African Americans could receive medical care, though they were confined to the colored ward. This was an era when doctors held absolute authority. Patients, especially poor black patients, were expected to trust completely and ask no questions. The concept of informed consent didn't exist. If a doctor wanted to use your tissue for research, they simply took it. No permission required, no explanation given. The medical establishment operated on a simple principle. The advancement of science justified almost anything. And in this environment of unchecked medical authority and racial inequality, something extraordinary was about to happen. Her name was Henrietta Pleasant, but everyone called her Henny. Born in rural Virginia in 1920, she grew up in a log cabin that had once housed slaves on her great-grandfather's plantation. After her mother died, giving birth to her 10th child, 4-year-old Henrietta went to live with her grandfather. She was a woman who took pride in her appearance, always wore neatly pleated skirts, bright red nail polish, and had the most beautiful hazel eyes. Henrietta loved to dance, often with one of her 5 children in her arms. She was the emotional center of her household, where the extended family gathered, and the door was always open to anyone in need. In 1941, she married her cousin David Day Lax, and they moved to Turner Station, Maryland, a working-class community outside Baltimore, where Day could find work in the steel mills. Henrietta was 31 years old, a devoted mother, living what seemed like an ordinary life. But Henrietta Lacks was about to become one of the most important people in the history of medicine. And she would never know it. In early 1951, Henrietta began experiencing something that terrified her: abnormal vaginal bleeding. For weeks she felt a knot in her womb, as she described it to her cousins. The pain was getting worse. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta took the trolley to Johns Hopkins Hospital. In the gynecology clinic, she was examined by Dr. Howard Jones, a prominent physician who had seen thousands of cases in his career. What Dr. Jones discovered made him stop cold. On Henrietta's cervix was a tumor unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was massive, shiny, and had an unusual purple color. The tumor was so aggressive and distinctive that Jones later said it looked almost otherworldly. Dr. Jones performed a biopsy, cutting away small pieces of both the cancerous tissue and healthy cervical tissue for testing. This was standard procedure. They needed to confirm the diagnosis and determine the best treatment approach. But here's where Henrietta's story takes a turn that would change medical history forever. Without Henrietta's knowledge, consent, or even awareness, Dr. Jones sent those tissue samples to Dr. George Otto Gay's laboratory, just across the hall. Dr. Gay was a cancer researcher who had been desperately trying to grow human cells in laboratory dishes for over 20 years. Every tissue sample Dr. Gay had worked with before followed the same disappointing pattern. The cells would survive for a few days, maybe a week, and then die. This made meaningful research almost impossible. You can't study cancer, test treatments, or understand cellular behavior if your samples keep dying. But when Dr. Gay's lab assistant, Mary Kubitschek, placed Henrietta's cells in a petri dish with nutrient broth, something unprecedented happened. The cells didn't die. They didn't just survive, they thrived. They doubled every 20 to 24 hours, dividing and multiplying at a rate Dr. Gay had never seen. Within days, they had completely filled their container. Dr. Gay had to keep dividing them into new dishes because they grew so aggressively. Dr. Gay named the cell line HeLa, using the first two letters of Henrietta's first and last names. But to him, these weren't Henrietta's cells anymore. They were simply a research tool. While her cells were thriving in Dr. Gay's laboratory, Henrietta was dying. The cervical cancer was spreading throughout her body with the same aggressive speed that her cells were growing in the lab dishes. She returned to Johns Hopkins repeatedly for radium treatments, the best therapy available at the time. But the cancer was too advanced, too aggressive. On October 4th, 1951, just 8 months after her first visit, Henrietta Lacks died. She was 31 years old. But here's the extraordinary thing. Her cells didn't die with her. Even after Henrietta's death, Dr. Gay's team took more tissue samples during the autopsy. The HeLa cells continued growing, continued dividing, continued multiplying in laboratories around the world. Dr. Gay began sharing the cells with other researchers, shipping them to labs across the globe. These cells became the foundation of modern biomedical research. They were used to develop the polio vaccine that saved countless children from paralysis and death. They helped scientists understand how viruses work, how cancer spreads, and how the human immune system functions. HeLa cells were sent to space to study the effects of zero gravity on human tissue. They survived nuclear testing. They were used to develop treatments for HIV, leukemia, influenza, hemophilia, and Parkinson's disease. When COVID-19 struck, HeLa cells were crucial in developing the vaccines that ended the pandemic. By now, scientists estimate that if you weighed all the HeLa cells that have been grown since 1951, they would total more than 50 million metric tons. That's more than 100 Empire State Buildings worth of Henrietta's cells. And through all of this medical revolution, through all these life-saving discoveries, through all the billions of dollars in profits generated, Henrietta's family knew absolutely nothing about any of it. So what made Henrietta's cells so unique? Why were they immortal when every other human cell sample died within days? The answer lies in something called telomerase. Normally, human cells can only divide a limited number of times before they age and die. It's like a biological countdown timer built into our DNA. But Henrietta's cancer cells had an active form of telomerase that kept resetting this countdown, allowing them to divide infinitely. Her cells also had other unusual characteristics that made them perfect for research. They grew incredibly fast, they were hardy enough to survive shipping around the world, and they were aggressive enough to contaminate other cell cultures, which actually became a huge problem in laboratories worldwide. The HeLa cell line became the gold standard for medical research. Scientists finally had human cells they could experiment on without experimenting directly on people. They could test new drugs, study disease processes, and understand human biology in ways that had never been possible before. Over 110,000 scientific publications have cited the use of HeLa cells. That's more research papers than any other laboratory tool in history. Nobel Prize-winning discoveries, breakthrough cancer treatments, understanding of how genes work. All of this became possible because of cells from Henrietta's tumor. But here's the devastating irony. While HeLa cells were generating billions of dollars in profits for pharmaceutical companies and advancing medicine for everyone else, Henrietta's own family was struggling in poverty. Her children couldn't afford health insurance. When they got sick, they often went without medical care. Her daughter Deborah suffered from anxiety and hypertension but couldn't afford proper treatment. The same medical system that was profiting from their mother's cells was failing to provide basic health care to her descendants. This wasn't just oversight, it was systemic racism embedded in the medical establishment. The 1950s were a time when black patients were routinely used as research subjects without their knowledge. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments were happening simultaneously, where hundreds of black men were deliberately left untreated so doctors could study the progression of the disease. The Lacks family didn't learn about HeLa cells until 1975, 24 years after Henrietta's death. A scientist contacted them asking for blood samples to help with genetic research, and that's when they first heard that their mother's cells were still alive and being used around the world. When they learned the truth, they were confused, angry, and felt betrayed. How could doctors take someone's cells without permission? How could companies make billions of dollars from those cells while the family lived? In poverty? And most haunting of all, if the cells were still alive, did that mean part of Henrietta was still alive too? The fight for justice took decades, but it finally came to a head in 2023. On August 1st, what would have been Henrietta's 103rd birthday, her family reached a historic settlement with Thermo Fisher Scientific, one of the world's largest biotechnology companies. The lawsuit accused Thermo Fisher of unjust enrichment, continuing to mass-produce and sell HeLa cells even after it became widely known that they were taken without consent. The terms of the settlement are confidential, but it was the first time a company was held financially accountable for profiting from Henrietta's cells. Ben Crump, the civil rights attorney representing the family, said something profound at the settlement announcement. Not only were the HeLa cells derived from Henrietta Lacks, the HeLa cells are Henrietta Lacks. This settlement opened the floodgates. The family has since filed lawsuits against other pharmaceutical companies, including Ultragenyx and Novartis. The legal strategy is spreading to other cases where medical research was built on exploitation. But perhaps more importantly, Henrietta's story fundamentally changed medical ethics. Today, informed consent is legally required for medical research. Patients must understand how their tissue will be used, and they have the right to refuse. Institutional review boards now oversee research to prevent the kind of exploitation that happened to Henrietta. Johns Hopkins has established awards and buildings in Henrietta's honor. The World Health Organization gave her a posthumous award for her contributions to science. Her story has been told in books, movies, and documentaries. But here's what really haunts me about this story. Henrietta Lacks is just one name we know. How many other people, especially people of color, made involuntary contributions to medical progress? How many families never got recognition, never got compensation, never even knew their loved ones' bodies were being used for research? The advancement of medical science has always come at a cost. The question is, who pays that cost, and whether they have any choice in the matter. Henrietta's cells have probably saved your life or the life of someone you love. The polio vaccine, cancer treatments, COVID vaccines, all made possible by her immortal cells. Every time you receive medical treatment that works, every time a vaccine protects you from disease, every time a drug saves a life, you are benefiting from research that may have used HeLa cells. Part of Henrietta Lacks, a poor black woman from rural Virginia, is woven into the fabric of modern medicine. She never knew she would become one of the most important people in medical history. She died thinking she was just another patient, another statistic. But her cells live on, continuing to save lives 70 years after her death. The question we have to ask ourselves is this: was the end result worth the means? Can scientific progress justify the exploitation? And what do we owe to the people whose involuntary sacrifices made our medical miracles possible? Sometimes the most important people in history are the ones whose names we never knew. Until today. I'm Alex Reed, and this has been Real Dark Cases.